This is Stories from the Hackery, a podcast about the students, alumni, and community members that continue to shape Nashville Software School. Nashville Software School is the nation's first nonprofit coding boot camp where a person with aptitude and motivation can gain the skills needed for a career in tech. For more information, visit us at nashvillesoftwareschool.com. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Stories from the Hackery. I'm John Work, founder and CEO of Nashville Software School. I'm happy to be joined today by two NSS graduates. We have Pemberton Heath from the second cohort of our Software Engineering with Java AWS specialization program, and Rob Schulteis, who's a graduate of the sixth cohort from our part-time data analytics program. We're going to get them to introduce themselves in a little more detail here in just a second. But what we're going to try to talk about today a little bit, first, we want to talk about what's been happening in Pemberton's and Rob's career since leaving NSS, but with a focus on how they've been using and what they've learned about generative AI as a tool and as a productivity aid or not. So this is a follow-on to our second annual survey of NSS graduates regarding the impact of generative AI on their work and their careers. So we've published a couple of blog posts about the results of the survey, and we'll put a link to those in the show notes. But this is a chance to actually talk to a couple of graduates from two different programs to see what they've been learning, what they've been experiencing as they go. So, but before we get into AI, let's hear a little bit, learn a little bit from these two graduates. So, Pemberton, I'm going to turn it over to you first. Give us the Pemberton Heath personal elevator pitch.
Great. Well, I feel for anyone who's in an elevator with me where I make a self pitch. But yes, I will give you my little mini background. So my name's Pemberton. I grew up in North Carolina, went to University of Virginia for undergrad, and started my career as a high school math teacher. I worked in education for some time, both teaching high school math and also high school English. I had a 3 or 4 year sort of, wouldn't call it detour, but sort of side path into medicine. Studied medicine, actually went to medical school for 2 years, decided a career in medicine was not right for me, but took all those learnings back to teaching, taught a few more years, and then eventually found Nashville Software School as a place where I could potentially pivot into a new direction. So I loved the fact that they all still offer the, I guess it's called a jump start, little 3 weeks sort of get your feet wet in software. And I will be the first to say I never considered myself like a tech savvy person. I just loved solving problems, but I was like one of the last holdouts to want to be, teaching stats with the TI-83 and not R or Excel. So that ages me. But I did the jump start in Python. I was completely hooked. I would not want to leave class. I would stay upstairs on my computer working on problems and looking for more problems I could solve. So I applied and attended the second cohort of the sort of back-end focused Java program with AWS sort of exposure. And my first role out of Nashville Software School was as a full stack developer, and I am still a full stack developer. So I might have diverted from just my personal elevator pitch, but that's a little bit of Nashville Software School as well.
Okay. Well, yeah, you kind of got your NSS story in there too, which is probably going to be the next question I ask. So it's good. We kind of got them both. It's a longer elevator ride that we thought we got there. So tell us, can you share anything about, so you're a full stack developer, you're still working for the same employer that you worked with coming out of NSS? So, or no, you've changed roles.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I've changed. Yeah, I can give you a little more about my sort of career progression since then, since I went on and took it all the way there. So right out of NSS, I was hired by a startup actually based out of Nashville, called Reload. They had
Neat.
hired a few NSS grads in the past.
Right.
Worked there for about 6 months. Had an incredible experience. Learned a huge amount. And then another opportunity came my way via another NSS connection. After some conversations with Jeremy Bacher, joined his team at Novi Connect and joined sort of as a full stack developer. My work has moved closer and closer to sort of the back of the stack. I'm touching the front end less, but importantly, along the time I was in the boot camp, I did develop sort of more robust front end skills and did my capstone using the React framework. And I think that really opened opportunities for me. I worked a lot in React in both jobs, especially at the beginning before I was able to move sort of closer to the back. So I'm now coming up on about 5 months at Novi Connect and have had a fantastic experience there as well. And
Right.
all three are different language stacks.
Yeah.
All four: Jumpstart, Bootcamp, first job and second job. But I actually think we'll get to this later. But the advent of generative AI has made sort of transitioning between language, I think, so seamless that that hasn't been a problem.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's bookmark that because that'd be a great thing to talk about. So, so you're working with several NSS
Yeah.
associated folks at
Beck, Gene,
yeah,
Jeremy.
yeah.
So we've got a little cohort
All right.
within.
Oh, that's cool. I had not. I think maybe somebody had told me that, but I'd forgotten it. So that's very cool. All right. Well, Rob, let's sort of give you a chance to ride the elevator. So who's Rob? Give us your elevator pitch and maybe your NSS story as well.
All right. Yeah. So my wife and I and our little one, we live in Marquette, Michigan. I grew up in Wisconsin, but I moved to Nashville in like 2011 and was in the music industry for a number of years. Left that because of the long hours and the pay in the music industry can be a little tough for a while. And so I got out of that and I started working for Johnson Controls as a commercial fire alarm inspector. So a pretty huge pivot. But what that afforded me to do is to spend more time with my wife and spend more time at home. And um, we just started talking about wanting to start a family, and we moved up to a little town on Lake Superior. Uh,
Ooh,
and yeah, Marquette's really nice, and we made that move, and we're happily up here in nature. We're both nature lovers. Like, I'm a nature person at heart, but I love tech too, so I get kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. But my NSS story really does start with my wife. She was part of E17, the web dev cohort, Python and Django and all of that. And her instructors, Lynn, Sydney, and Trevor, she adored them, and she was having such a great experience. And she knew that I had kind of a tech background. When I was younger, I started writing HTML when I was in middle school and things like that. And then I found a guitar and ended up in the music industry. But she knew that I had that background, and she was like, "Hey, I think you would really enjoy this. You should look and see what's available." And at the time, there wasn't another web dev cohort for a number of months. And she's like, "No, you need to do this now. Like, you need to do this now." I was like, "Well, there's a data analytics jumpstart or a data analytics course happening in like a month, like less than a month, I think." I was like, "Well, I'll see if they still have an opening." So I applied, and all the stars aligned, and I ended up in DA6, and now I'm a lead instructor.
all right. So yeah, so we can sort of talk about what you're doing as an instructor. I'm not- I can't remember since you graduated. How else how else have you had a chance to use your analytics chops?
Yeah, so while I was going through DA6, it became apparent. I remember sending Amanda Partlow a Slack message at one point. I had been jamming away on like a SQL script for a while, and when I solved it, I remember sending her a message, and I was like, "Hey, this is the script that's probably changed my life." And I started searching for jobs right then during the SQL portion of the cohort. And I first reached out to the company, to Johnson Controls, because it's a big company. I was like, "There's got to be like some sort of data role." And I ended up finding one. It was remote. I reached out, and I didn't hear anything back. I didn't hear anything back. And then through Michael Free and my wife, they were like, "Hey, just reach out to the gentleman. You have his name, his email." So I bugged him, and eventually I ended up getting a job offer about a week before the cohort ended at Johnson Controls. I have moved on from Johnson Controls since then, but I was a learning data analyst there, and it was a really nice, a really good junior role where they didn't have a data analyst beforehand. So to take everything I had learned at NSS and bring that to them, they had very limited reporting, very limited knowledge of SQL or Python. So I was able to bring that and like create a robust like reporting platform for their learning data. And it was great. I can't imagine a more perfect role to like transition into. And now I work as a BI developer for Syndigo in a much more data robust role.
Okay.
We're gonna hit all the things, data analysts and data engineering and all of that.
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, you're getting to use all your skills, and as you alluded to, I think I'm kind of immediately on graduation, started helping out with, I think first as a junior instructor with Amanda, right?
Yep.
And since then, I think have been continuously engaged with some part-time cohort as a junior instructor. And then when Amanda decided to, she wanted to have a life, who knows? Uh, you've kind of moved into a lead role now with what your second cohort, I think, right?
So this is my first as a lead. But yeah, I've been with NSS since I was a student. Like it's been back to back since.
Yeah. So, well, we got the family hook
Yeah.
into your family. So,
Yep,
but yeah,
yep,
so
yep.
you've been now working as an instructor, and I'll probably loop back around on that and have a question or two about I mean, first of all, why? And then, but also how does that impacted, facilitated, whatever the rest of your career growth? Is what would your thoughts be on anybody else who kind of wonders, is this something I might want to do? So Pemberton, you might be interested in knowing that, you did some work. You got yourself to being a full stack engineer, even though you attended a cohort that was very much server side oriented. We're going to be starting a kind of a facilitated self-study program for SE graduates in 2 weeks, I think. I think it's November 4th. So Gabe Sisprus, who was one of our SE instructors,
One of mine. Loved him.
yeah. So Gabe's got a ton of front end experience.
Totally.
So we're putting together a workshop that will let any of our seekers from SE who have not, found a first job yet, get themselves some experience in React and JavaScript, and get themselves a certificate that will get them to where they can really compete for a full stack job. Because with the way the job market changed after we sort of just, launched that program in our collaboration with Amazon, the job market's changed. You've seen
Totally. Yeah.
to where
I think that's brilliant.
yeah, to where those so that'll be and we're offering that free to
Yeah.
everybody.
Wonderful.
So that'll be cool to be able to get those boxes checked for everybody.
Definitely.
All right. So, well, let's kind of move on to our main topic here. So, generative AI, large language models sort of burst on the scene. We all became aware of them starting late 2022 with ChatGPT, what was it, 3 or 3.5 or whatever it was. And I mean, they weren't new at that point because there had been a GPT and a GPT-2, and anybody who followed AI knew that this stuff was bubbling and had been for quite a while. Neural networks are not a new thing. They've been around a long time. And a lot of the generative AI work comes out of the original work on neural networks. In fact, we just had somebody win a Nobel Prize in physics, of all things, for their work in some of the original neural network work. So not new, but in terms of public awareness and potential real world use, ChatGPT was pretty much a bombshell, right? I mean, that everybody's attention got lots of attention. And within 3 or 4 months, we were all told it was going to put us out of work. So since then, I believe there's been some reevaluation of that position. But nonetheless, this is a technology that is reshaping jobs and careers in a number of different fields. If you're a writer, it's a big deal. It's had big impact, right? And it certainly seems to be true in any field that involves the creation of software, which would include data analytics, data science, software engineering, software development. So we did a survey in 2023. We did another survey in 2024. We kind of said, well, okay, there's all the hype and there's all this stuff from people who have self-interest in hyping this technology. Let's find out what's really going on out there. Who better to ask than our grads who are working in the field? And so we ran a survey in spring of 2023. We ran another survey spring of 2024. You both responded to the spring of 2024. And in addition to checking the boxes on the survey, you guys both dropped some comments. And so I'd like to sort of dig in a little bit more to kind of what you've learned, what you've experienced, where you're seeing value. I'm being assumptive that you're seeing value someplace where you see challenges or issues or whatever. So just want to talk a little bit about what is the state of the world here regarding this stuff. And then maybe later we speculate a little bit based on what your experience and where it's going. So let's talk about that. So let me find my questions. Well, so I know Pemberton, you said in your survey response, one of the things you said is that you use, I think specifically ChatGPT. And so one of the things that let's do is we answer questions is if you've worked with multiple tools, let's sort of distinguish the tools we've used and where different things have been useful or not useful or those things. But one of the things you said is you use it basically daily as a coach or mentor to explain concepts. And I think, Rob, you might have said something similar, explaining concepts and things. So maybe we'll start there, right? Because that's not generating code. But it is supporting you in your work. So let's talk about that a little bit. So Pemberton, you want to maybe kick off
Sure.
here?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely my number one use case. And I mean, daily is not even totally accurate. It's like hourly. Um, I pretty much work with, I now have shifted from ChatGPT to Claude. So that's Anthropic's
Right.
equivalent. I have found that it just does better for my use cases. My company has an enterprise subscription to GPT. So if I'm going to drop a large block of code, I'll use Chat GPT. But for most of the conversations I have, I use Claude. Um, I feel incredibly lucky to have come into this profession when this tool was available. I basically feel like I have a senior developer with an abundance of experience and truly infinite patience who's sitting next to me who will take any question that I ask all day long, and I'm not wasting their time and they don't have anything else to do. So it has been just beyond a gift. When I'm very curious by nature. So, okay, this works, but why?
Right.
Or is this the best way to do it? Or why, I'm following a pattern that I see. Why was this pattern done this way? Why is this method here in the controller? I would think it would go in the model. Can you explain the sort of different choices of how to architect this? So I just talk to it all the time for those reasons. And it's pretty funny because my younger sister's name is Claudia, and we've always called her Claude for short.
Oh
And
boy.
when she found out that my new BFF was Claude, she was pretty disheartened, but they serve different purposes. That's my primary use case, and it has spanned so many things. The first time I used it in that way was when I was trying to sort of round out my full stack capabilities as a NSS student, and I used it to teach myself React. I was still learning how to use it, so it wasn't nearly as effective. I was still um, a long way away from where I am now in terms of the kind of questions I knew to ask and what I knew it would be good at. But I think if people use it like this, it can just sort of turbocharge your development because you have a you have a mentor who's literally all yours all day long. It's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Well, yeah, many of the productivity studies that have been published on developers using these tools, one of the things they point out is that more junior people get greater productivity benefit. And I wonder if, particularly because if people are using it for the use case you've identified, I wonder if that's why, right? Be, you know, thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I'm curious how they're defining productivity.
Yeah.
I don't know that it makes me tremendously more productive on a day-to-day basis. I think it allows me to grow my understanding of software and the uh, so much faster. So maybe over a year, my productivity is tremendously increased because I'm able to learn and integrate understandings that would have taken me much longer. I also think because of the way I use it, like the gains I get in instead of pushing up a PR and getting feedback from a senior to refactor the method to make it, more concise or to add better error handling, I can take a method I've written, drop it in and say, help me improve the error handling. So in that way, there's a productivity increase. On the other hand, I might then ask 5 follow-up questions of why did you handle the errors like this? And da 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 da. And those aren't really being seen in the daily productivity gains,
Right.
but they're creating within me a knowledge that's allowing me to contribute at the level beyond someone who's been in the field as long as I have would be able to ordinarily, because they simply wouldn't have the time to stop and ask those questions all the time. And I would say on the day to day, it's probably net neutral. But in the long run, it's not as much about productivity, but just more about growth as an engineer and development.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like what it's doing, if I sort of paraphrase a little bit, is it's accelerating your movement from junior to intermediate.
100%.
Right. And so it's accelerating the growth of your career, uh,
Absolutely.
and your ability to provide value as a developer, taking on bigger tasks sooner than you might otherwise be able to do. Now, I've
100%.
I've made a few leaps there, but
No, that's exactly right, and I think it can work that way if you sort of recognize what are the skills that I can bring and I can um, add value with that a computer cannot do, and then how do I outsource to a computer like the things that aren't as important for me to do. For example, adding error handling. As long as I understand the concept of why we did it, I don't need to sit down and study the syntax because in 3 months I'm going to be writing a different language probably, or at least that's how it's been so far. So I think that it does accelerate your professional development if you are using it to enhance and build the things that um, really make a human valuable to the organization.
right, right. Well, that's awesome. All right. Well, hey, Rob, let's sort of hear your story on how do you use it? What's your primary use case, right? What's your
Yeah.
how do you and sort of how do you feel about, what Pemberton has said about how she's using it, the value that she sees for her? How is it sort of playing for you?
Yeah, I would say I can second everything Pemberton said about how I utilize that's my biggest use case for it as well. Especially so starting out at Johnson Controls, I actually wasn't allowed to use it. Johnson Controls had a very hard there's
Yep.
no you can't use it. It's a fireable offense if we see it on your history or whatever. So Johnson Controls at the start, I don't know if it's the same, but at the outset of it, Johnson Controls like no go. So I couldn't use it at my first job. But Syndigo is different in that as long as we're not just plopping code in there, they're okay. So the big use case, like their own native code, the big use case for me is like developing my understanding of advanced concepts. And one of the things that Pemberton was was talking about having this like senior developer at your fingertips, where I think it's like crucially important for juniors is in remote work. We don't have in remote work, we don't have somebody to go and talk to. Like we don't have that mentor at the ready. We can't go and sit down and talk with a person who can maybe walk us through at the level that we need, so that having this is crucially important for junior developers in a role for that reason. Is, hey, now I'm seeing much more advanced code than I saw at NSS. Can you and the what I think the one of the beautiful things about it is like you can have it explain it to you in so many different ways.
Mm.
If you tell it, hey, explain this to me like I'm an 8-year old, it will explain it to you like you're an 8-year old. If you know any different way you need to kind of prompt it to get out what you need, it can do very well, and it's very good at either staying high level or as in depth as you want. And that's been very critically important for my feeling of moving from a junior developer to where I feel like I'm a much more like intermediate developer as it stands right now. And a lot of that has to do, and at the rate that I was able to do it, has to do with being able to prompt and ask ChatGPT some of these more like theoretical questions rather than it just generating a bunch of like code. It's been incredibly helpful in translating, and Pemberton touched on this as well. I Where I work now, it's Indigo. It's not just SQL and Python. We have Scala, which is a much more verbose language than Python is. It's very verbose. It's much different. The syntax is very Java like.
Right.
So being able to translate, I know how I'd write it in Python, and being able to be like, what is the syntax in Scala? I have no idea. And it spitting that back to me, and you're able to actually learn another language so fast because you can relate it directly to what the
Right.
other language is.
Well, and that's an interesting
Um,
example because Scala also has different, even conceptual roots compared
yeah,
to
it's
Python, JavaScript, Java.
yes,
You've got sort of that. You got some of those functional roots. You've got some of those other things there.
yeah,
So it's even got sort of a different paradigm of programming. So and so
yeah.
you found it helpful helping you grok all that.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I was able to discern pretty quickly at the new job is you can kind of find areas where, because we use Databricks, which is where the Scala comes in,
Right.
and they stood up everything very fast. So there's things that you're able to identify. It's like, hey, we're using Scala, but we may not be utilizing it to its full potential. Here's some ideas we can test out, and you get those from just like these theoretical questions of what in Scala, what would be a optimal way to write this or to achieve this sort of goal. And to be able to get these different options and be able to test them out, it's not necessarily writing the code for you, but it's giving you a framework to work within, and having that framework just allows you to focus and hone in, and not be spending so much time trying to find these bits yourself. You have a framework to work in, and then you're able to A and B things at a much more rapid rate. But I do also agree, it's not like it's daily. It's not just, I'm not packing in 12 hours of work in 8 hours just because there's ChatGPT now. I feel very much like Pemberton does. Like over the course of a year, it's going to increase productivity, but more so over the year, it's going to increase my comfort level at what I'm doing, which inherently will make me faster, like more efficient as a developer and engineering pipelines and things of that nature. I also do get this unique experience being a teacher as well, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah.
That's probably a different question.
That's probably a little bit different question. We'll get there. So, all right. Well,
Yeah.
that's cool. So ChatGPT, is that the primary generative tool that you've had experience using?
Yeah, I use Copilot. I also use it for kind of more mundane. I'm not very good at writing like super business, like an out of office message. I can just be like, hey, can you rip off an out of office message for this time period? I'm not very good at business speak sometimes. As far as emails go, I can present myself very business like in a meeting, but when I'm typing it up, sometimes I feel like I'm just like it's like, this needs to be just a touch more professional. Can you just like brighten it up for me? So even mundane things like that, I'll use it for. But I'll use mainly ChatGPT, but Copilot every so often. And Copilot is one that Syndigo is okay with.
Okay, so you are allowed to use
Mhm.
Copilot on the job.
And they don't have any restrictions on ChatGPT really. It's just like if they prefer you to use Copilot, but they also it's with like, hey, there can't be any proprietary code
Don't let it
uploaded
don't
to any prompt engineering. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, and that's a point that I wanna, kind of reinforce because that's one of the things that we see all the time, right? Is some of our major employers, in fact, the largest employers in terms of hiring NSS grads, got a number that are in the healthcare industry or work on projects for the healthcare industry. And so far, those guys are all like, no freaking way. You shall not, right? You shall not touch any of these tools on your work computer, nothing, right? Because of intellectual property concerns, HIPAA and privacy concerns, right? I mean, it's all over the place. So not everybody has the opportunity to use these tools in their professional environment. Although I suppose almost anybody could have their own personal license. I mean, you can use Claude for free even, but you can also get yourself, I think most of these are still $20 a month for their professional subscriptions. Rumors are all over the place that the price of poker is going to go up one of these days, but right now I think they're all kind of about $20. And that using it as in the role of a coach or a mentor or something away from the work computer and stuff is, I think it's a viable option for almost everybody. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I can think of most of my use cases. If I listed like the top 6, 5 would not involve copying any code, and those would all be usable if you had your personal laptop up. I use it if I get in trouble with Git, if I've committed something to the wrong branch. It is amazing at helping you unwind that. I use it, uh, I've used it I used it extensively to prepare for interviews for my second job. So I was working in C Sharp, React, C Sharp, Azure, SQL Server, Management Studio, kind of Microsoft
right,
heavy stack, going to a job with that was Ruby on Rails, Python Django, some React, PostgreSQL or Postgres. So just having it saying, these are the skills that I have, these are the skills that I need. What are some questions? How can I connect what I know to what is expected from the job? Those kinds of things. None of that would require sort of you to compromise your employer's position,
right,
but it could still really accelerate your growth as a developer.
yeah. Well, and that's another great use case, right? Is as a coach to help prepare you for interviews because we all know interviewing for tech jobs is an unnatural act. So having
Yeah.
anything that can help you with that is great. So there's a couple places I want to go next. Let me go here next. Pemberton, you made a point when you were talking about you weren't as good using the generative AI tool when you were first starting out, and that you had to learn you really had to learn how to use it, which I guess speaks to learning how to do prompt engineering. Basically, I think is our term of art for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, can the two of you talk to a little bit about learning how to use it effectively, right? How did you kind of come to grips with what are more effective ways to ask questions of my perma buddy here, right? And are there any resources that either of you use to sort of help with how to ask better, how to ask questions better, or to ask better questions of
Totally.
so I'll just open that up, let you guys go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Well, when I was speaking to sort of being less effective in using generative AI in my initial phase, how I got from there to where I am now, I would kind of say 3 things. One is trial and error, specifically learning from what was not working.
Right.
Then the other side of that coin, trial and error, learning from what was working. And then thirdly, I actually sort of took the lead on a project when I was working at Reload that involved using the OpenAI API to use their generative AI response for a use case that we were working with. And that prompted me to really dig into the world of prompt engineering. And that gave me a little more sort of formal training that I was absorbing into my own personal life to most effectively engineer the prompts for our use case, and then learning, you know, as I was learning how to optimize prompts, sort of bringing that into the way I interacted with it. As an example, Rob, you had mentioned sort of you can ask it to explain something to you. So I will, a little thing I picked up from sort of my explicit learning on prompt engineering was giving your mentor a title and a personality. So I will say, like, you're a highly experienced engineer and you specialize in Git and source control or version control, or you teach computer science and I'm in your 101 class. Help me understand Docker. Okay, I'm actually a high school student. Let's take it back a level. So that was from my formal training. And then I can, at some point, I'll let Rob speak first, but I can kind of dig into sort of the trial and error learning. I think learning from what wasn't working was maybe the most impactful, but it was kind of the combination of that experiential and sort of explicit learning.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, for me, it's very similar. It was just out of a lot of trial and error. What worked for me, you just I tell my students this all the time, like, just keep trying, and you just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall, and eventually you start developing this understanding of how you get the results that you're looking for from it. And I've been out for a while, so it's very quick at that. But at the beginning, learning that, like Pemberton had said, like, talking to it like it is the senior engineer that you're talking to, if that's the level you're needing, or or like Pemberton just said, if it comes back a little too up here, it's like, okay, maybe I'm not ready for that yet. Bring her down a notch. But yeah, because of the teaching, I have a unique opportunity to really test it, like, out of the gate, and really push its limits to see how really, I guess, good it could be. I was able to see where it would falter, what languages it falters in. It's not like one of the things. It's not very good with DAX. It's not very good at Power BI DAX. Like, I know that if I have a DAX question, I'm not going to go to ChatGPT. It's something I'm gonna bang my head against the wall for, and just probably go to Marco or Alberto, the guys that know it really well. So you find out these nuanced things. You can tell what it's asked more often, like what is asked of it more often. It's very, very, very good at, where it probably doesn't get as many DAX questions. So it's not quite
Yeah,
there
right.
when it comes to that. So it's just kind of learning these nuanced things about it, and that just comes with utilizing the tool and understanding the kind of the verbiage and the verbiage that you need from it. Understanding that sort of, as odd as it sounds, that sort of relationship between you and this thing that's helping you learn. It'll eventually be a more natural conversation the more you use it, and the more natural of a conversation it is, it's the better it seems to be. I don't know. That's what I found. I feel like when you're talking to it like a person, it kind of is a little bit better.
Yes, talking about relationships with these things, you're creeping me out. Okay.
Not like that. It's
Hey,
not what I
man,
mean.
I always say thank you at the end, and
Yes, I can't not.
I this was not my idea, but the CEO of the first company I worked for made the good point that when we are subservient, I want to be on the list of people who were polite.
Always, yes, always be
You
Thank you
polite.
so much.
want to be on
And
the
if I'm having to ask for like a third or fourth, the other day I had this use case where I was assigned a very small task about essentially looking into why an environment variable was getting set improperly in a kind of task file script we use to spin up our containerized development environment. And anyone who was in my NSS cohort knows that I like had the Docker problems from Hades during the capstone. And when I got to a Docker first development environment in my second job, I was like, that was one of the first things I did was ask GPT to explain Docker to me as if I was a middle schooler, and it was talking about like freight shipping and shipping containers, and it helped. But that's a slight digression. For this task, I was able to kind of identify the line that needed to go, but I didn't really understand why. And there's a lot of complexity between how environment variables are set at compile time, at runtime, if they're being get grabbed from a parameter store in AWS, when do they get overridden? And I must have had to ask GPT to re-explain this 5 or 6 times. because it was just not clicking for me. And in terms of treating them like a person, I did say, "I'm so sorry to have to ask you to explain this again," which is a little bit ridiculous, but also speaks to the fact that if that was a real person, I would have stopped after the second explanation and
Right.
said, "Okay," and moved on and either never understood or gone and tried to figure it out by myself. Because we do have that feeling of embarrassment if it's taking us a
Yep.
while to get
Yep.
something and we're taking someone's time. And so then the second piece of that is it's also like wonderfully human in some ways. It said, "It's okay, don't worry about it. These are difficult concepts. Let's try again." And it explained it to me again. And then at the end of all of that, I was able to say, "Okay, summarize what you taught me into a one-page PDF for me to put in my notebook
Right.
and take that out of it." And so, yes, we joke about being personal with them, but I think the fact that you have sort of that endless patience and also sort of the humanizing of like, it's okay that you don't get this yet, coupled with explanations truly ad infinitum. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Well, and you make a couple, I think, really good points there. I mean, one, it's a great example of the infinite patience, right? Even if you were sitting next to your senior developer, they ain't got that much patience
g-
because if nothing else, they got to go to a meeting or something, right?
yeah.
Then it's just not going to be able to sit. But
Or they're frustrated that they can't figure
well,
out how to explain it.
that's
And
right.
that's another thing.
Yeah, they don't get frustrated. Yeah, that's been my experience. They don't as much get frustrated as you for still question. They get frustrated themselves for not being able to find the way to explain it right, right?
Totally.
But either way, it cuts off. It really kind of cuts off the ability to ask a third time, ask a fourth time. So I mean, I think that's a great point. It's a good example of and that it coming back and saying it's okay. I've had sort of slight examples of that in some of the stuff I've done too. And it is funny. I mean, and I think, look, we all know that junior developers, junior data analysts have big problems with imposter syndrome, right? And sometimes we are just not willing to ask. I don't remember you being particularly bashful, Pemberton, but nonetheless, sometimes we just don't want to ask, right? Because
Right.
ChatGPT don't care, right?
Yeah.
And
It's got nowhere else to be.
yeah, right. What else am I going to be doing here? So
Yeah.
I think that if it can help juniors get past that, or at least learn to manage it. I don't know. Some of us don't ever get past our imposter syndrome, but but not worry about it, right? Not be constrained by it. Still
Yeah.
feel free to be able to ask.
Yeah. And I don't even think this is something that's specific to juniors. I think,
Well, no, it's
you know,
not.
yeah, there are resource constraints and you've got someone's patience with you, their patience with themselves, the reality that they have obligations that they need to attend to. And so I think it's incredibly liberating to be able to ask the questions and not have to think about sort of, yes, I have this question, but is this the right time to ask it or should I wait?
Right. Right.
And that's something that for me, I'm inherently extremely curious, and even in meetings, have sort of worked with the feedback of great mentors to ask myself, does this question need to be asked right now, or can it wait, or can it be asked async, or something like that? And so, a place where there is sort of no cost to questions is, I think, sort of the beauty, other than a few tokens.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, I do need to ask. None of you have mentioned this as a primary use case, but we hear so much about having these tools generate code. Sounds like that's not a principal use case for either of you, but what has your experience been with using them to generate code? Good, bad, indifferent. What's your observation so far based on what you've both experienced? Rob, why don't you kick this one
Yeah.
off?
Yeah. So it is incredibly good at fundamental code. Like it's pretty scary good at fundamental code. And I don't know if you want me to go down this road, I can wait till later, but that plays a part as being an instructor. It being so good at that and being able to take being able to take a question and just a question that has no code in it and turn it into code is pretty remarkable, especially when it comes to the fundamentals of the languages. The more complex it gets, the more it starts to deviate where you would have to you're going to want to be anything. If it's generating anything for you, you want to be double checking it for sure. But um, like I said, it is pretty, in my experience, it is very scary good at fundamental code, whether it be with what we teach SQL or Python, and even Scala. I working with Click right now, which has this weird SQL like back end. It's very scary good at the kind of fundamental code.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you can isolate its task to writing a piece of fundamental code, it's perfect.
Yes.
Problem is, there's a lot of work involved in isolating that task. And I think that
Yes.
where people run into problems is they try to jump ahead to that. When you're writing code in sort of in the corporate world or the working world, you're almost never starting a new file and
Right.
writing code. You're writing code within a context. And so much of how to write that code is understanding the context that you're in, what's already happening in the file, and how you're needing to modify, add, delete, or change the behavior of the code. And I often find that writing the code itself is like the last 3% of what is required. So at that point, when I finally figured out what it needs to be, sometimes I will usually sort of like pseudocode the method. And then I will drop that code in and say, write this in Ruby. Or I'll write a rough draft of the method that might not. Ruby has all these like sort of funny things where they don't put parentheses around the condition in the if statement. And if it's like structured like this, you use unless, or you put if at the end, and all these weird things. And so instead of devoting cognitive load to those things, I free up my cognitive load to put forth the logic that I need. And then I let generative AI polish the method. So it is incredibly good at that. But I think that what young developers probably miss is that that is just such a small part of what you're doing when you're writing code, that where you really run into trouble is when you try and have it do everything for you. And I am not an instructor, but having had a background in education for 6 or 7 years prior to sort of coming into this career path, I feel really strongly about the dangers of having it write code for students, because it also is wrong a lot of the time. And the smaller chunk you have it right, the less likely it is to be wrong. And the more likely it is that you're asking it to do the last 10% or the last 5%,
Right.
because you've found the 3 lines that needed to be added. And then it's probably going to do that correctly. But when you don't really know what you're asking it to do and it writes 30 lines of code, the chance that there's a mistake in there is very high. And the chance that you really understand what it needed to do and what it is doing is low. And I think that's where you run into problems.
Yeah. Yeah. I just saw a study. I think it was last weekend that I came across it. It's a new research study on productivity. I mean, we're just now getting to the point where we've had these tools long enough and we've been able to get enough experience with, where we're starting to get some decent statistics on where they're good, where they're bad, things like that. And this one was a study on the impact of these tools on learning. If you use them to generate code, they have a really negative impact on people learning to code in the first place. So this was used with computer science students, but you know, and it actually significantly degraded their understanding because they were dependent on it too soon. So
Yes, that's it.
they didn't know how to distinguish good code from bad code yet, or even working code from non-working code. So and that's, I don't know, it's the thing the thing we saw in our survey of grads, the thing I hear from everybody who works with these things is, you let it generate a very big chunk of code, it's going to have errors in it, right? So, and
Yeah.
there's some interesting stats about increase it, including I think in a recent study from, this one might have even been a Microsoft, GitHub study or GitLab, one of the two, because they both published some studies recently about error rates. in code.
Yeah.
And oh boy, error rates go up. So
Yeah. It's a couple things also, things you don't realize when you're first learning are that there are patterns and styles. So even just today, I had a task in a sort of a rake file that I asked GPT to add better error messaging and error logging around, kind of one of the use cases I shared earlier. And when reviewing it with Jean, former NSS instructor, she asked kind of why I had added the error messaging in like that. And was it wrong? No. But was it sort of like consistent with the way the other methods had done it in that file? No. And so there's also nuance. There's not just code that works and code that doesn't, or code that's right and wrong. There's also, are you following the patterns that are set forth by your code base? And GPT is actually pretty good with that if you provide other examples and then say, please follow the patterns. But that's another layer of thinking that is involved. I think that ultimately this comes down to the misguided notion that developers spend a lot of time writing code,
that's that.
and we spend a lot of time reading code.
What
And I think if
Mhm.
you can use GPT to help you read, which I do a lot, that's a place where it can really help you get oriented. If you drop into a 500-line file, this is where I'm really lucky that my organization is sort of all in on, if it helps you be more productive. We're not in healthcare right now, so we don't have those HIPAA concerns, but we do have an enterprise subscription. I can drop an entire file in and say, orient me to sort of the primary methods in this file. Or what I do more often is, if there's a method I know I'm going to work in, but it's very complicated, I will say, let's read this method together, walk me through line by line what's happening. And that has been especially helpful as I've switched from Python Jumpstart, Java Bootcamp, C Sharp First Job, now both Ruby and Python. Extremely helpful because I can kind of get the gist of it. I'm like, okay, there's a loop here, this, but I might not recognize some syntax. And so I think
right?
using it as a reading guide as much as a writing guide, even though it's technically generative, it's really just generative in its response. It doesn't mean that the use is for generating code.
That's yeah, you're right. Which
Mhm.
I think is a misunderstanding people have.
Yeah.
I think the point you make about people misunderstanding just what percentage of a software engineer's job is writing code, much less writing brand new code in a clean file. Yeah, because that's not most of the job. I'm sorry. Most of
No.
the job is understanding 4 generations of prior developers crap code,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
That translates in the data world too. It's the same. It's the same on this side of the fence too. You spend more time understanding the nuance of the things that other people wrote.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's something. I mean, it's an incredibly common thing we all run into. We drop into a new job. What's the first thing you gotta do? You gotta learn the code base, right?
Mm.
And it can be a big code base, right? You drop into a job at, well, I better not use
Oh,
any
yeah.
names. It can be hundreds of thousands of lines of code in thousands of files, right?
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah.
so I've read a couple of interesting, I guess they're more like case studies of trying to use generative AI as a tool for understanding a new code base. One was written in a company that's a well-known consultancy, and kind of going through where they found it was useful, and where the tools still need work, right? That they're not helpful, partly because the context is so big. If you're dropping into
Yeah.
something that's got a
That's the
thousand
challenge.
files and 600,000 lines of code, that no LLM can handle that kind of context unless you actually train it on you actually go through training on the code base, which
Right.
which you could do. I mean,
Right.
you could take Llama and train it, or some other open source. Well, you could even do, I suppose, some sort of retrieval augmented generation using ChatGPT or something. Although
Yeah.
that puts that whole code base out there in the world. So, although they swear they won't do that if you pay the subscription, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, that kind of thing in the big, when you're talking productivity in the large, not productivity in the small, that kind of help me understand. I just dropped in from outer space in this new code base. Help me.
That
That's
would be incredible. That would be incredible for productivity and so lucrative, because to think of how many months you pay a developer that can hardly do anything because they're just busy learning the code base. And that, interestingly, I, with no context coming into sort of the profession, felt very frustrated with how long it was taking me to learn the code base at both of my jobs until someone said, time out.
Yeah.
We don't really expect a senior engineer to come in and be able to contribute for about X months because that's about how long it takes to learn the code base. And first of all, I felt better that this wasn't a personal problem. I just had no idea that that was kind of how things went. But secondly, to think of the lost productivity every time
Oh,
you
yeah.
hire someone new that could be sort of mitigated by this, that to me is a use case that has a lot of potential, and I wouldn't be surprised if big tech companies have
Oh,
their internal LLMs already doing this.
yeah,
But
yeah. There are people working on
yeah,
and in fact, GitHub Copilot can be like Microsoft's got a
yes,
licensing scheme where you can use it for enterprise and you trade it on your stuff. But yeah,
yeah,
but that's true. I mean, even hiring the most senior engineers. Well, just talk to Gene about it, right? I mean, Gene's an incredibly experienced senior engineer, but the day she dropped from the sky into her last employer before NSS, how long did it take her to understand the code base, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's an incredible and
yeah. And so much of I think this ties into something else, which is these tools that can help write code and do a really good job of it are often not thinking about, I haven't actually tried prompting it to explicitly think about this, but thinking about maintainability and readability. And are you using terminology that's consistent with the rest of the terminology in your
oh
code
yeah,
base? And are
oh
you
yeah,
making this as easy as possible for someone who's coming behind you to understand? And I'm actually pretty sure that if you prompted it with those goals, it would do a good job. But some of that is outside of its ability given its narrow context window because it might not know uh, how this type of thing is referenced elsewhere in the code base,
right, right.
things like that.
Yeah, right. The thing you want to look at for that might be 17 files away somewhere. And
Yeah,
it's at least in today, the tools that most of us have access to in the current
current
we don't get that.
scenario.
Now,
Yeah,
those kinds of things can be fixed, although it's incredibly expensive, right? Training these things costs a lot of money.
right.
And that's we did an interesting well, I thought it was interesting. We did the last podcast we recorded last week with one of our directors, a guy named Brandon Valentine, who for the last 5 years ran the consulting group at GitHub that worked with the largest development shops in the world. And so the last couple of years, guess what they were all doing? GitHub Copilot, trying to get everybody up to speed on using generative AI and stuff. And he had some interesting observations about what's contributing to the layoffs and the lack of hiring in the big tech. It's it's how incredibly expensive it is to do the training on these big models, and that's consuming. Yeah, where do you get dollars from? Well, in the tech industry, you get dollars out of people, right?
Right.
So he kind of talked about sort of what he'd observed and how this is contributing to what's going on right now, and also why he thinks that this is all the slow job market is also going to end here pretty soon because there's still problems to solve, and these tools
Yes.
aren't going to solve them by themselves, right?
I
No.
think that the fundamental thing is just that what it means to be a developer is changing and the skills that make you good at the job. I don't have a lot of sort of backward looking perspective on this in the way you do, but in the very short sorry, just trying to give reverence to
I got lots of backwards looking. Yeah, right.
your experience and perspective. But in the sort of even in the time that I've been in the industry and just the way that coming into the second cohort of the software engineering boot camp, the way I sort of conceived of being a developer and the kinds of things we were learning, what I think makes you hireable now is just different. And
Yeah,
I think that there are certain sort of skills to hone that maybe were not as important. And there are certain skills that would have seemed critical that just aren't in the same way. And I think that for students and recent grads, that would be my message, is figuring out what it means to be a good developer now, because it is a little bit different.
Yeah, it is. It's evolving. We've been talking a lot at NSS about, for, I don't know, 12 or 15 years, we had a fairly stable, in the software world, we had a fairly stable definition of what a job ready junior looked like, right? 80% of the jobs, they're full stack. They need front end, and that means HTML, some CSS, some JavaScript, some Git and GitHub, React or Angular or whatever the framework of the framework of the month club. And you had to have some server side. And it's not as important which one. You just got to know a stack, and you got to know a language well enough to be able to stand up a web service and create an API and all of those things. And that agreement had been stable for quite a while. After taking a few years to stabilize with the internet and Web 2.0 back in the early 2000s, well, now it's shaken up again, right? And
Totally.
it's not all just generative AI. I don't think. It's also cloud platforms. It's also, there's other things in there, right? Because
Yeah,
we never just put one ball up in the air. We're always juggling. Hey, it's shiny. Let's put it in the mix. But there's no doubt it's evolving, and it probably will be a few years before it stabilizes again. So we're actually doing some work, and there'll be some news from NSS over the next few months. We're doing some work on trying to both understand the shifting definition of job ready. And I think it's true in data analytics and data science as well, Rob. The tooling changes, the understanding you need of how to be an effective problem solver. What I think hasn't changed is we still need problem solvers
yes,
that,
that is it.
1,000,000%.
that can use
It's
these tools to solve problems, right?
yes,
And
that has become the most important thing, because the generative AI can fill in the gaps
yeah,
in everything else, but it cannot fill in the gaps in problem solving. And so I think that
Yeah.
becomes something that used to be a one thing you need, and it's okay if it's not your best attribute, to this is the if I were hiring a new developer for my team, I would want, problem solving and basic understanding of core concepts would be the two things.
Yep.
And everything else is fluff that can be filled in
yeah. Well,
easily.
because we can all learn the tools.
Exactly.
We can all learn all these concepts. And if we got to get down into complex data structures, if we got to get into those things, well, the generative AI tools can help us learn them. But if we've got to learn to grapple with them, given the nature of the problem we're working with, well, we can do that, right? Anybody who can
Yes.
learn to be an effective problem solver in this environment can pick up new concepts and new tools. And so,
Yeah, and I want to though circle back to one thing we talked about, which is if you lean on generative AI before you understand code, sort of the problems, and to go back to basically make the argument for why you still need to go to NSS, um, you can leverage the power of these tools to help you learn. You can leverage the power of the generative AI tools to help you learn the tools you need to do your job if you have a foundational level of understanding. And if you
Mhm.
skip that step, you're kind of always confused.
yeah, yeah,
And you have to
Yeah.
get that step. And I think that that's where AI is insufficient, and you need humans, because even though, yeah, humans do run out of patience, an AI can't screen share with you and help you figure out, like, why is your code not compiling? Like, do you just need to restart your computer? Do you need to, kill your Docker container and spin them back up? Whatever it is, that person who can get you to the point where you can be a little bit self-sufficient in your learning, but you don't I would consider myself a great problem solver, having taught math and gone to med school. Those are strengths, but I couldn't have skipped NSS, because I couldn't have taken advantage of generative AI to teach me to code without having that really strong understanding of object-oriented programming, and not having an AI sort of assisted learning experience for that first round.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
that feels right to me. Pembroke. We still have to have a foundation, right? And which sounds like a great transition, Rob. You're
Yeah.
actively engaged with data analytics students now. And how do you feel about what Pemberton just said, thinking about your own experience, thinking about what you're seeing from students? How does this, what is the best way for us to fold this into the learning experience for people coming from outside the profession, the career field, to getting them up to speed?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take it back a little bit to something we discussed earlier, and I've been itching to get to this part because I don't mind talking about myself, but I'd rather talk about people who are trying to get into the profession, and it's something I'm very passionate about, which is why I'm teaching, and I love this, and it's a big part of who I am. We were talking about this. What's difficult in an instructor's role is something that we talked about earlier that is a benefit to ChatGPT out when you have a job, is the ability to go and have this senior who's not going to get frustrated with you for asking a number of questions. But it's more on when we're asking questions like Pemberton and talked about, you get to question two. If you still don't understand it, then you as a person, not necessarily from the other side, don't want to ask another question. And having that in a classroom is where ChatGPT becomes more dangerous, and where we as instructors have to try and throw things at it to make students as comfortable as they possibly can be to come to us first, because it's very easy for them to go to ChatGPT. And what I've been in a number of cohorts now is that if I put myself in the hot seat, right, it makes the students more comfortable to come to me with a question if they've watched me make mistakes. I try to cultivate this, and this is another thing um this is why I do my best to. I think we have to frame, if we're going to integrate it into a learning program, we have to do it in a very like careful, like, and thoughtful way. I try to cultivate this environment where mistakes are what I want to see. I want to see you make mistakes. I want to see it. I want you to be comfortable making mistakes, because as as we know here, anybody who codes, there's a lot of mistakes involved. That's where a lot of the learning comes
Right.
from. That's where the majority of my learning has come from. So what I've found is when I took over as lead, I was trying new things to figure out how I can connect with the students on that level where they're not afraid to make mistakes. I encourage them to talk about things that don't work for them in front of, like, when we're in a lecture. And what I found helped is, if I am the person who's live coding in front of them with no rehearsal, they can watch me make mistakes, because you're going to make them. Like, I don't know anybody who can just sit down and rip out perfect code. I don't rehearse it. I don't do anything like that. And um, make sure that my mistakes are visible, and asking them first. Like, when I notice that I make the mistake, asking them first is like, hey, where did I make a mistake? How can I fix this? And have a conversation with the person who is trying to teach you person to person, not from ChatGPT to person. And I think it's going fairly well, but you can't keep ChatGPT out of the classroom. So we have to figure out how to push students to use it in a way to enhance their learning without giving them the answer, without them making mistakes. That's where, like Pemberton has talked about, that's the danger of it. Is you're not allowed to make the mistake. Like, ChatGPT is going to make the mistake if it makes a mistake, and then you have to, like, I I'd rather you make the mistake and come to me, and then we can talk about it, and you develop this. It's the fundamental understanding that Pemberton was talking about. That is the most crucial thing for going out into the world, is understanding things at a fundamental level, because no matter how complex the code base is, how complex our data structures is, when something's broken, it comes down to fundamentals 9,900 times out of 1,000 or 10,000. It's 99% of the time, it's going to be a fundamental, just easy miss, just in a maybe nested complex location. And I think fostering that without ChatGPT generating the code for you and you not allowing yourself to make the mistakes is huge. And it's hard because, like you said, people are most comfortable that not every student is someone who is a vocal person. There a lot of people who get into tech are very introverted people. They're not naturally extroverted and may not want to ask questions. So we also I also have this feeling I can't fault people for gravitating to this because it may be your natural introverted personality to not want to ask your instructor a question, not want to inconvenience somebody, and trying to cultivate something where I don't want you to ever feel like you're inconveniencing the instructional staff. The instructional staff has to kind of put that on their shoulders where, all of us get frustrated, but when it comes to teaching, like, just put that aside. These are students who are trying to change the outlook of what their experience is right now. And I don't think that ChatGPT has to be totally wholly out of it, but I think that when we do recognize it being used in a way that we don't want, we one-on-one, we talk to those students and we say, hey, this is why it's dangerous. Like, this isn't like you didn't do anything wrong. Like, we just want to tell you why it's dangerous at this time, when we can also talk about, as we've been talking about, how beneficial it can be. It's this hard thing to kind of juggle, but I believe that it's something that we definitely can do in an NSS environment. It's going to have to be thoughtful because the fundamental understanding of what we do is so vitally important. And I think from the cohorts that happened before ChatGPT, there is a difference between the fundamental understanding of students leaving is different from before generative AI and after generative AI. I have definitely seen that firsthand and trying to figure out how to work with it because it's not going away and we're not going to be able to block students from using it. But instructing them like we're supposed to do as to how to use it, why we don't recommend using it in this way, so that they can, and then reinforcing, come to me first if how I don't explain it works. Like, not everybody speaks your language. Talk to my junior instructor, talk to my TA, reach out to, maybe there's a student in your class who's excelling. Like, try to find your resources who speak your language, because I'm not always going to speak it. And I know that as an instructor. Don't take offense if they go to my TA or go to my junior instead of me for questions. It's like, whoever speaks your language, like, find that person and exhaust those resources first, because you'll probably find somebody who can speak that language for you, and then you'll have this better framework when you leave that you can take and then start applying to prompt engineering and ChatGPT in an environment where you don't necessarily have somebody who's an instructor who's going to an instructional team who's going to foster your learning process in that manner. And the way that we do at NSS, that's why I love NSS, was the focus is always on the learning experience, and you may not get that at your job.
Yeah, it's interesting, Rob. You raise a sort of a danger of GPT that I hadn't thought about. I've definitely sort of obsessed about and thought a lot about it as a former teacher, sort of the short circuiting of learning that can happen if you use this essentially to write code before you learn how to write code. I've often sort of used the metaphor in my mind of, like, we can listen to audio summaries of pretty much anything. And if you just jump to that before you learn to read, you really hamstring yourself in terms of
Mhm.
your ability to function in the world. How could you look at the original text and the summary text that you listen to and determine if it's an accurate summary? You can't. So it's like that foundational piece. So I've thought about that. But one thing I hadn't thought about that you raised is, as a teacher, one of the primary things you're always trying to do is get visibility into your students' learning process. Now, that's in theory why we have assessments, is not
Right.
to assign student some number that then affects their sense of value and self-worth, and they go home and they either celebrate or cry because they got an A- for the first time in their life and their world is ending. Um, that's just a flavor of my experience as a high school teacher. But in theory, we assess because we want to understand where a student is in their mastery. And we get data on what a student's understanding is in a lot of different ways. And one thing you made me think about, Rob, is that one of the ways we get that data is by the questions they're asking us. And if
Mhm.
they go mute on questions, then we lose a window into their
Right.
understanding. And I
Yeah.
had not sort of thought of any downsides to that because I was in a cohort, was a I want to say 26 students maybe and two instructors. And it was more often than not that you could not access an instructor for a question just by the sheer numbers. And so I had never thought of there being any downside to extra resources for asking questions. And I asked a lot of questions to the internet I didn't really figure out how to start using GPT till the end of the course, but I regularly went elsewhere for questions because a lot of my questions were curiosity questions that I did not feel like needed to be prioritized or there just simply wasn't access. So I think the question is I hesitate to discourage people from using this amazing resource to ask questions, especially when human resources are limited. But how do you encourage them to use it in a way where you still maintain a pipeline of visibility into where their understanding is and you don't lose that sort of communication with the student? And I think that can be in terms of like non evaluative exit ticket type things at the end of the day where it's like, what are you still not understanding? It's anonymous. But trying to work around that instead of, I really shy away from saying GPT is a last resort if you can't talk to an instructor because maybe that liberates the instructor's time to work with a student one on one who really needs the help, as long
Mhm.
as you can still know where your student's understanding is.
Well,
Yeah, and that has been sorry,
no,
John. I just want to piggyback off of something Pemberton said. That is one of the things that it has been the biggest thing that we've noticed is it's harder to gauge a student's understanding throughout the cohort because not all the questions come to us
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Some of them get fielded
Yeah.
fielded elsewhere, and we've always and it's like NSS has always been like Googling is part of this skill that you want to develop because you're going to have to find resources and whatnot. But so not all the questions always came to us, but it's even dramatically dropped off. So
For sure.
figuring out a way to cultivate a learning environment where it can be as open a platform as it can possibly be
Yeah.
is what we're going to have to like navigate.
And I mean, I think that GPT has just pushed the education field in
oh
a
yeah,
million different directions. And I mean, I think of people whose job is to teach critical writing skills and it's like how do you do that effectively now? And depending
Yeah.
on the content and the context in which we teach, GPT's pushing us in different ways to evolve. But I think one of what I'm hearing is one of the places where we have to evolve is like, hey, we can't rely on student questions as much as a way of measuring understanding. So how else are we going to do it? And seeing the opportunity for growth in that, because there are certainly ways in which student questions are a flawed proxy for understanding, because you've got the student who's never going to ask the questions. They're always going
well,
to be
Yeah.
too
right,
embarrassed
yeah,
or whatever it is. So I
right,
think it's actually a way that our field has to evolve.
yeah. Well, and yeah, and how do we deal with that fact that we've got to make sure that they get that foundation right?
Mhm.
So I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, and I think teaching is never a very exact science, and
Much more of an art.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's just gotten more complicated, right? And
Absolutely.
in some disciplines, I think probably more than others, but I think across the board. So well, guys, we've been going an hour and a half, and I'm loving this discussion. I'm just loving listening to you guys talk about this and reflect on kind of what you've learned about these tools, this technology. I'd love to I'd love to pursue Pemberton your experience with actually embedding generative AI into an application, right? Using the that would be a great topic for a discussion. I mean, just there's I got 4 or 5 notes. You'll both be hearing from me again. So, but we've gone an hour and a half. We've taken at least as much time as we suggested we would take of yours. So, at least for today, I'd kind of like to bring this together. But
Sure.
I think this has been a great discussion. I think people are going to really enjoy hearing what the two of you have to say. I think this will be really good for students. I think this will be really good for just everybody who's kind of wrestling with, geez, what is this? Um, so so I want to thank both of you for being so generous with your time. Really appreciate it. really enjoyed the conversation, the insights, the thoughts, the experiences that the two of you have had. Pemberton, please say hello to the rest of your crew. I know some of those folks pretty well, and tell them I
We've
said,
got a great group.
oh yeah, tell them I said hi. I mean, Jeremy, Jean, Beck. I mean, that's
It's a powerhouse over there.
yeah, I would say so. So tell them I said hi and apologize for stealing you away for 90 minutes. But thank you. And Rob, we already get a huge chunk of your week anyways. So thank you again for doing this
Yeah.
and sharing the insights.
Absolutely.
So we're going to wrap up this episode of Stories from the Hackery. And hope you enjoyed the discussion with Rob Schulteis and Pemberton Heath. There'll be some links down in the show notes to some other discussion, maybe a couple of these research papers I talked about, blog posts, and so on. And I hope we could pick up some of this discussion down the road someplace too. This was cool. So
Sounds good to me.
thank you
Great.
both.
Thanks for having us, and I enjoyed the
Yeah,
conversation.
thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for all
Yeah.
that NSS does.
All right. Thanks, everybody.